The most dangerous moment in any deception operation is not when the trap is set. It is the moment the adversary begins to believe they already won. 3 weeks before the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb saw the largest coordinated ballistic missile engagement in the history of U.S. naval operations. A mid-grade network security technician at a Defense Logistics Agency contractor facility in Norfolk, Virginia, opened a routine software patch notification at 8:22 a.m. and clicked an embedded hyperlink that his security training had specifically warned him never to click. The notification looked legitimate. The formatting matched the official DLA software update portal exactly. The digital certificate was valid. The hyperlink destination, when examined by the forensic team that would reconstruct the event 3 weeks later, resolved to a server cluster registered through a shell company in the United Arab Emirates, routed through a commercial cloud infrastructure provider in Singapore, terminating in an access node that Naval Criminal Investigative Service analysts would eventually trace with high confidence and no ability to act on it in time, to a cyber operations directorate operating under Iranian Ministry of Intelligence and Security oversight. The technician clicked the link at 8:22 a.m. By 8:31 a.m., a persistent access implant had established itself in the contractor network. By 9:14 a.m., it had laterally moved through 3 internal network segments using credentials harvested from the technician's active session. By 11:47 a.m., it had reached a read access node connected to a logistics scheduling and positioning database that handled, among other things, the routing and waypoint coordination for resupply operations supporting U.S. Navy assets operating in the 5th Fleet area of responsibility. The implant did not modify anything. It did not delete anything. It simply read, quietly, for 19 days. What it read over those 19 days was an extraordinarily detailed picture of U.S. carrier strike group positioning in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden. Resupply schedules, transit waypoints, fuel transfer coordinates, escort timing windows, maintenance cycle projections. All of it legitimate, all of it current. The Iranian intelligence picture of the strike group's operating patterns became, within 19 days, more accurate than anything their satellite reconnaissance assets had ever produced. And then, on day 19, the implant made a mistake. It was not a dramatic mistake. It was not a crash or a detected intrusion alarm. It was a file access log entry that was 4 characters longer than any legitimate read operation on that database tier would ever produce. A naval cyber defense analyst at Fleet Cyber Command in Fort Meade, running an automated log anomaly review at 2:15 a.m., flagged the entry as statistically improbable. She ran a secondary query against the access pattern timeline. The implant had accessed the same database node 44 times across 19 days at intervals that were slightly, microscopically, too regular for organic user behavior. Human database access patterns have variance. This had almost none. She had the implant forensically isolated and analyzed by 4:30 a.m. without taking it offline or alerting the operator. The implant continued to read. It did not know it had been found. By 6 a.m., the picture was fully understood. By 8 a.m., the 5th Fleet Commander and the Director of Naval Intelligence had been briefed. By 9:30 a.m., a decision had been made that required a level of operational nerve that very few commands in the history of the U.S. military had ever been asked to demonstrate. Leave the implant running, not just leave it running. Feed it. The operation that the 5th Fleet designated Copper Mirror was built on a single foundational premise. The Iranian intelligence architecture had spent 19 days learning exactly where the carrier strike group operated, exactly what its resupply patterns looked like, techniques, and exactly when and where it would be most predictably positioned. That knowledge was now the adversary's greatest vulnerability, because everything they planned to do with it, everything they would task their healthy proxy network to do with it, would be aimed at coordinates that the U.S. Navy was about to carefully, surgically, completely falsify. Beginning at 11 a.m. on the day the implant was identified, the DLA contractor database began showing modified positioning data. The changes were subtle, not a dramatic repositioning that would trigger suspicion, but a gradual drift in the strike group's projected transit waypoints, resupply coordinates, and escort timing windows that accumulated over 5 days into a picture showing the carrier operating approximately 31 nautical miles northeast of its actual position. The maintenance cycle projections were modified to show a radar cross-calibration window, a period of reduced sensor performance. Coinciding precisely with the window, the Iranian planners would calculate as their optimal strike opportunity. The implant read every update. It transmitted every update. The Iranian planning cell received a continuously refreshed, internally consistent, completely false picture of where the most valuable naval target in the Western Indian Ocean would be in 9 days. On the 5th day of the modified data feed, a signals intelligence platform operating in international airspace over the Red Sea intercepted an encrypted communication burst between an IRGC coordination node and a Houthi ballistic missile command element in the Yemeni highland interior. The burst was partially decrypted within 6 hours. The decrypted fragments contained coordinate references that matched precisely the false positioning data that had been fed through the compromised database. They had taken the bait completely. What followed was 9 days of preparation so comprehensive and so deliberately invisible that the operational security requirement alone consumed the working hours of over 200 personnel across 4 commands, none of whom were permitted to discuss their contributions with each other through any channel the implant might conceivably have touched. The carrier strike group continued to operate its standard pattern, modified just enough to maintain the false positioning picture without creating navigational anomalies that a skilled analyst might notice. Every emission, every flight operation schedule, every logistics coordination signal that touched any system the implant had access to was sanitized, reviewed, and if necessary, adjusted to support the deception. 2 Ticonderoga-class cruisers were repositioned to firing coordinates calculated to provide overlapping SM-3 engagement coverage of the complete ballistic threat corridor from the Yemeni plateau. Their presence was masked through the use of emission control protocols so strict that the ships maintained radar silence for 47 continuous hours. Relying on passive sensor fusion and data link targeting from the strike group's E-2D, advanced Hawkeye airborne early warning aircraft to maintain their tactical picture. A 3rd Burke-class destroyer, designated as the designated intercept anchor for the terminal phase, was positioned at a coordinate that appeared on the false database as an empty stretch of water with no military significance. The Yemeni plateau, meanwhile, had been under 24-hour surveillance from 3 separate collection systems since the day the implant was identified. Thermal imaging satellites tracked the movement of mobile ballistic missile transporter erector launchers from their storage facilities in mountain tunnels to their pre-surveyed firing positions. The number of launchers observed over the 9-day preparation period was 8. The number of launchers confirmed in firing position at 10:47 p.m. on the night of the engagement was 11. 3 additional platforms had arrived from a secondary staging area that the pre-existing surveillance had not fully mapped. The intelligence team updated the threat assessment at 11:02 p.m. 11 launchers. Estimated salvo capacity: between 18 and 26 ballistic missiles, depending on launcher load configuration. Potential time on target: a single compressed volley or a phased 2-wave sequence designed to overwhelm intercept capacity in the terminal phase. This information was received in the Combat Information Center of the lead cruiser, with the quiet, controlled acknowledgement of people who had already run this number through their engagement planning 6 times in the preceding 9 days. 11 launchers was within the parameters, not comfortably within. At 11:31 p.m., the Houthi ballistic missile command element transmitted a final targeting update to its launch platforms. The coordinates in that transmission matched the false database positioning exactly. At 11:33 p.m., the first thermal bloom appeared on the satellite surveillance feed as a Birkin 3 ballistic missile ignited on the plateau. Its exhaust plume visible from low Earth orbit as a white streak against the dark terrain. Then a second. Then 4 more in rapid succession. Then 3 more from a separate cluster of launchers 12 kilometers to the east. Then 2 more from the third cluster. 11 launchers. 22 missiles in the first salvo, all of them aimed at empty ocean. None of the missiles were aimed at the carrier. The carrier was 31 nautical miles from where the Houthi targeting picture said it was. But empty ocean was not where the engagement would be fought. The engagement would be fought in the airspace above where the missiles were actually going. And that airspace was precisely where the U.S. Navy had spent 9 days positioning everything it needed. At 11:34 p.m. and 08 seconds, the 2 Ticonderoga-class cruisers ended their 47-hour radar silence simultaneously. Their SPY-1A arrays, activating from cold to full power in the same 2.3 seconds, acquired all 22 ballistic threats within the first sweep cycle. The combat information centers on both ships had been running on pre-computed engagement solutions since 10 p.m. The SM-3 launches began at 11:34 p.m. and 31 seconds. First pair out of the lead cruiser. Second pair 2 seconds behind. The second cruiser launched its first pair at 11:34 p.m. and 44 seconds. The salvos climbed in overlapping trajectories, their exhaust plumes briefly illuminating the hulls of the ships as they cleared the forward VLS cells. A cold, blue-white fire that reflected off the water and was visible for 11 seconds before the missiles ascended beyond the range at which their exhaust was bright enough to see from the surface. In the combat information center of the lead cruiser, the tactical action officer tracked the engagement display with both hands, flat on the console surface. The display showed 22 orange threat tracks climbing toward their apogee and 16 white interceptor tracks climbing to meet them. The mathematics of the engagement were not reassuring. 16 interceptors against 22 threats left a theoretical residual of 6 ballistic missiles arriving in the terminal phase for the closer-in systems to handle. The closer-in systems were ready. But 6 terminal phase ballistic missiles in a compressed time window was a scenario that every intercept model rated as manageable only if every system performed at or above baseline expectation, with no failures and no surprises. The first surprise arrived at 11:35 p.m. and 52 seconds. 4 of the 22 missiles were not following standard ballistic trajectories. They had been fitted with maneuvering reentry vehicles, a modification to the Birkin 3 airframe that U.S. intelligence had assessed as a developmental capability. The Houthi inventory did not yet operationally possess. The assessment had been wrong. The 4 maneuvering reentry vehicles began their terminal guidance corrections at 60,000 feet, altering their approach vectors in patterns specifically designed to defeat the engagement geometry that the intercept solutions had been calculated for. 2 of the 16 interceptors already committed to those target tracks lost lock on their updated trajectories and detonated outside effective lethal radius. 2 missiles were now unengaged in the terminal phase. The tactical action officer had 4 seconds to redirect. She authorized 2 emergency SM-6 engagements from the Burke-class destroyer on the southern intercept line and simultaneously committed both CIWS systems on the lead cruiser to full autonomous engagement authority. The SM-6 launches happened at 11:36 p.m. and 03 seconds. The intercept solutions were not clean. The SM-6 was not designed as a primary ballistic intercept asset at that range. But the engagement geometry, built through 9 days of precision positioning, meant the missiles were crossing directly through the destroyer's optimal engagement envelope. The first SM-6 achieved a direct intercept at 11:36 p.m. and 19 seconds. The second SM-6 achieved a proximity detonation that structurally compromised the second maneuvering reentry vehicle's terminal guidance system. The warhead did not detonate on contact. It tumbled. It impacted the water approximately 1 nautical mile from the lead cruiser's port beam. The impact threw a column of water high enough that it was visible from the bridge, 1 nautical mile. The crew felt nothing from that impact. The ocean absorbed the energy too far away for the hull to register it. But the fire control technician, who had been tracking that track for 41 seconds, who had watched the SM-6 intercept, failed to achieve a clean neutralization and then watched the warhead tumble toward the surface. Would later describe the 41 seconds between the missed intercept and the water impact as the longest interval of his professional life. Of the remaining 18 missiles, the engagement had proceeded on schedule. 14 confirmed intercepts in the exoatmospheric and endoatmospheric phases. The final 4 arrived in the terminal phase above the false target coordinates at 11:37 p.m., where they were engaged by THAAD battery assets in Djibouti, whose operators had been at full readiness since 8 p.m., and by SM-3 reserve rounds from the second cruiser. All 4 were neutralized. The last confirmed intercept was logged at 11:37 p.m. and 44 seconds. The sky above the empty patch of ocean at the false coordinates was briefly filled with the debris of 22 ballistic missiles that had been aimed with precision at a target that was not there. The carrier, 31 nautical miles away, continued flight operations. At 11:38 p.m., while the engagement assessments were still being compiled and the VLS reload status was being calculated, the signals intelligence platform detected a second burst transmission from the IRGC coordination node. This one frantic in its timing irregularity, a pattern consistent with an emergency query to a field asset that was not responding as expected. The Houthi launch crews on the Yemeni plateau were transmitting position confirmation requests. They were receiving no impact confirmation from their target area. They were beginning to understand that something had gone catastrophically wrong, but not yet why. They would not have long to wonder. At 11:44 p.m., 2 A-18F Super Hornets launched from the carrier's flight deck on a pre-planned strike package that had been loaded and ready since 9 p.m. They flew a low-altitude approach corridor that had been specifically selected to maximize terrain masking against the Houthi radar network. Their targeting solutions had been built across the full 9 days of surveillance, not just the 11 confirmed launcher positions, but the secondary staging area, the logistics resupply routes between the tunnel storage facilities and the firing positions, and the command relay site from which the final targeting transmissions had originated. The strike package delivered its ordnance between 12:09 a.m. and 12:17 a.m. The 11 launcher positions and their supporting infrastructure were rendered inoperable. The command relay site ceased transmitting at 12:14 a.m. The secondary staging area, which contained 3 additional launcher platforms that had not yet been moved to firing positions, was engaged at 12:16 a.m. At 12:31 a.m., the P-8A Poseidon conducting battle damage assessment over the Yemeni plateau reported that all assessed launch infrastructure in the target area showed thermal signatures consistent with total operational loss. At 1:15 a.m., a separate cyber operations team, working under pre-authorized orders, pushed a termination package to the Iranian implant, still sitting in the DLA contractor network. The implant received a file it interpreted as a routine database update, executed it, and ceased to function. The access node in Singapore went dark 11 seconds later. The shell company in the UAE had already been flagged for enforcement action through channels that moved slower than naval combat but arrived with equivalent finality. At 2 a.m., the Carrier Strike Group's logistics officer submitted a resupply request through the DLA contractor database, the real database, now fully clean, for SM-3 and SM-6 reload stock. The request was logged, processed, and routed without incident. The system worked exactly as it was designed to work. It had worked exactly as it was designed to work throughout the entire operation, because the people responsible for it understood that the system's integrity was not just an administrative requirement. It was a weapon. Now the accounting: 22 ballistic missiles launched, 20 intercepted in exoatmospheric, endoatmospheric, and terminal phases, 1 structural intercept short of full detonation suppression, 1 tumbled warhead impact in open water 1 nautical mile from nearest hull, 11 launch sites rendered inoperable, 1 IRGC coordination node neutralized, 3 additional launcher platforms destroyed at secondary staging, 0 ships lost, 0 U.S. casualties, 1 cyber implant active for 19 days, 1 analyst who noticed a 4-character log anomaly at 2:15 a.m., 1 decision to leave the implant running that required more operational nerve than any missile ever asked of any crew. The Iranian operation was not a failure of ambition. It was not a failure of coordination. It was a failure of a single assumption: that reading the enemy's data means you understand the enemy's intent. The U.S. Navy spent 19 days writing a story in that database, and the adversary read every word of it exactly as intended, right up to the last sentence. The last sentence was delivered not in text, but in the exhaust trail of 22 interceptors climbing into the dark above the Red Sea. In this form of warfare, the network you compromise is the network that compromises you. The data you trust is the data that was written for you to find. Until the ocean confirms otherwise, the strike group holds the line. That is the only record that matters.